Have we in Sri Lanka got our priorities right? Is there sufficient focus on those millions who are living below the poverty line? Even under this government, have we got everything straight? And are we really focusing on what is most important? Good evening and welcome to Face to Face. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Niresh Eliathambi. We have with us this evening Mr. Charith Gunawardena from the Institute of Political Economy, who we are going to discuss this matter with. Good evening and welcome, Charith.
Thank you very much, Niresh, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right. So, Charith, let's get right down to it. Poverty. Nearly 1/3 of Sri Lankans are below the poverty line, or they were during the latter stages of the last government. And we haven't heard that there has been a significant upliftment of the numbers there. So, are we focusing properly on this, or have we sort of got the strategy all wrong?
The first thing I would say is that there's a new government now who's been elected with a clear mandate to address some of the issues you just raised. And that's a very important objective they have to reach. But before I go into the details of the exact situation in Sri Lanka, it's really good to put it into perspective of how it fits in with the unjust nature of the global economic order. Because Sri Lanka, though is an independent country, we trade and operate in that global system. And it's important to understand the issues with that system and its impact on Sri Lanka, which in turn then impacts also the poorest in society. So if you take the current economic order we have today, it's basically set up after the World War II under the Bretton Woods Agreement, where the institutions like the IMF and the World Bank was established primarily to ensure global financial stability and also for poverty alleviation. But in reality, what happens is, so in theoretically, that's what happens. But right now, those institutions are more focused on looking after the interest of the global North countries and not much on the global South.
So that terminology struck me. You have the global North, the rich countries, the developed countries, and then you have the global South. It's as though we are living on another planet. Earlier they used to call us the third world, but that went out of fashion. Then we became the developing world, and now it's the global South. But nothing much has changed. Very few countries have actually broken out of the global South or the third world and made it to the ranks of the first world. You have a few like South Korea and the Asian tigers, but otherwise it's really, really hard to get out of this.
So there's sort of connection. I mean, previously we were colonized, we were colonial, under the colonial powers.
Which is a nice word,
right?
For, you could describe it in much more.
But what the way the financial system has been set up is right now we have this reserve currency, right?
Yeah,
it's the dollar.
The dollar.
That's the global reserve currency. Yes. So a lot of the trade has to happen in that in that currency. You also have other strong currencies like the euros or the yen or the Chinese renminbi, but not to the extent of dollar, which 70% of the trade happens on that. So when you have a country who controls the dollar, it's very important that country does not exploit that exorbitant privilege it has on that currency.
But that's what's been happening for decades, or even more than a century, I would think. The US dollar, and of course the US government directly supports it, which is understandable. But we saw just a week or two ago, Donald Trump openly threatening the BRICS countries, saying if you start trading in anything but the dollar, he's going to impose economic sanctions. So this is the world order that unfortunately we live in.
So for a country like Sri Lanka to operate in that, we need to really understand what that means. Because when we just talk about exports and trade and foreign direct investment and getting borrowings on international sovereign bonds and stuff, we need to really know how that operates. So for example, if you have any business or individual generally needs access to some credit, you need to access to fair credit, right? So even as a country, you need access to concessionary loans. Now, when these institutions like the IMF and the World Bank were established, they were funded by with the dollars and some of the bigger countries, the richer countries, and they were able to give concessionary loans to countries outside for people like Sri Lanka and stuff for development projects. Now, what happened since the great financial crisis in 2008 is some of those countries, they embarked on these quantitative easing programs, massive amounts of money printing, which has taken their debts to really unimaginable levels. So for example, though USA has 15 times our population of Sri Lanka, their debt levels are 1,000 times. So they have $34 trillion of debt. And when they print the money, they can absolutely buy any resource around the world because that's the currency. Now, what happened was they took that newly created money, not enough of that went into the multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. They did not, you didn't see a much big increase in that. And what those institutions told the countries like Sri Lanka is that now you're a medium income country. You can't access any concessionary loans from us. Go to the commercial money markets. Now, the money markets are where all these newly created dollars are sitting in. With the hedge funds and high net worth individuals have huge amounts of money.
But it comes at a price.
Exactly. So when we borrow, what I was trying to establish is that the whole system is geared by those multilateral institutions along with the global north, and they channel the people of the global south to access some of these funds, right, through their mainly commercial organizations. And if you take a lot of the sovereign bonds, they are governed by UK law and New York law. In the case of Sri Lanka, most of our bonds are governed by the New York law. So even the legal sides are sort of controlled by them, right? So when you start being channeled to go there, and you're also governed by those same institutions, you're in a really difficult situation. So when countries like us operate, or countries like Sri Lanka operating in this area, you really need to know the risks you're facing. It's not just what IMF tell you to do or what you learn in some of the textbooks, right? You have to protect yourself or take mitigating steps to protect yourself against the worst abuses. And I think that does not happen enough because we don't challenge that global order. We just say, yeah, export, borrow from the commercial money markets, right? The whole landscape, it's not an equal playing field here, right? And there are 53 countries today in the global south who are in serious financial debt distress, right? And it's not happened by accident. It's designed to be like that. The whole system wants countries like us to be not to manufacture. They don't want us to industrialize. So they want us to buy goods which really are subsidized there. So they talk about open markets.
But right? This is colonialism all over again, because this is what happened. I mean, in a nutshell, to put it quite simply, when the British were in India, the raw materials were taken back to the UK, which was industrialized, and then the products were sold back to India and other countries. So it's simply that same colonial system is continuing. It's just that the British aren't actually here. They are part of the global north, which is controlling the global south.
So they call it sort of financial colonialism rather than physically being there. But there's a huge impact on having this type of system, because once you have these type of situations where countries of the global south have to go and borrow in the commercial money markets, you need some sort of protection. Now, if you're an individual or a company, if you go bankrupt, you're protected by bankruptcy laws. There's nothing called a sovereign bankruptcy mechanism. So if you borrow from these commercial money markets and a country goes bankrupt, you're not protected by any laws. So there are really no risks these lenders are really taking, because they are very well secured. And if you take the case of Sri Lanka, when the interest rates in Europe and the US were 0.5% and stuff, we were paying 5, 6, 7% on these sovereign bonds. Now, we had paid a risk premium on some of those bonds. But why, when we defaulted, why are we still have to fulfill those obligations? And the lender takes very little risk. So one of the issues which people are sort of talking about is, if you're a lender who's fairly well protected, you do not do adequate due diligence, and you're not too worried about lending money to governments which are also not with a good record. So if there's corruption or there are they will still lend, because your money is still protected by that system.
But Charith, now when you borrow from a bank, the bank doesn't just, if you're an individual or a company, you've got a project, you want a loan to set up a factory or a hotel or something like that. The bank doesn't just write you a check. They do a lot of homework, and they don't just give you all the money at once. They will come and make sure that the project is happening, and they give everything in stages. And there's a lot of governance going on in this. But in the case of the international sovereign bonds, this doesn't happen. It's just sort of a blank check, and then this money is in the hands of our politicians, who the ISB holders, they know, everyone knows that these particular politicians are corrupt. I mean, there's no two words about it. There's nothing hidden about that. So this falls under odious debt, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So in the case of New York law, there's this concept of odious debts, and exactly what you explained is there. So there is a possibility for a government to challenge the lenders, and that happened. Ecuador did that some time ago, right? And if you can prove in the courts that these debts were odious, then there's a way of actually not paying back that whole debt, or get a sufficient haircut on those debts. So the ability to challenge that mechanism is very important. Now, what's happened with this current bondholder agreement Sri Lanka has signed is just before the previous the elections, a couple of days ago, before the elections, is that one of the clauses they put into that was that the lender can change jurisdiction from New York to somewhere else where this odious debt is not recognized.
Now, Charith, let me ask you directly. This agreement, 2 days before the election, this is not a coincidence. I'm sorry. I've been a journalist for 35 years. These things don't happen. You don't. You're an outgoing government. You're going out. You don't go and sign any kind of agreement for anything just 2 days before you're going out. Why would you? I mean, if you believe you're going to win the election, you'd wait till you win the election and then sign it. You don't just sign 2 days before. It's absolutely incredible as to, that happening. And then, of course, the present government has gone along with it so far. Why is it that we aren't challenging this on the grounds of odious debt?
So there are a couple of things. So that deal was agreed upon, and when you're a new government, they had a couple of options. One is to accept it, one is to reject it, or one is try to renegotiate. So if you try to renegotiate, and I think some of the things that we saw on the media was they were talking about wanting to have higher spending for social protections. But whatever happens, they were not allowed to change the core parameters, which is the 95% debt to GDP ratios, 2.3% primary surplus, 4.5% of debt servicing figures, and a few other things, which are really constraining Sri Lanka a lot. So they tied Sri Lanka to that, but they said, if you want to do other things with the agreement, as long as you're sticking to those parameters, you can do your own things domestically. But the option Sri Lanka then has is, if that's all they've given us, we either can say, and they're not willing to negotiate further, it's to say we are going to walk away or reject that, or try to delay it. But we don't know the inner discussions that took place. But if you try to walk away, you really need to know what the consequences are. And that's a sort of, for a new government who came in, and IMF came just 1 week after the general elections and 1 week after the presidential election, right? So you don't really have a lot of runway to understand all the consequences. So I think for practical reasons and pragmatic reasons, I think it's a really awful deal. But if you don't understand the risks, the consequences, it's irresponsible just to dive into something. So I think they've been cautious. I think they might know that there are dangers ahead, and you have to try and navigate yourself as you go forward. But some of these things are why it's also important to know the terrible type of harmful agreements that were signed prior to the election. Another classic one was there was a bill that was passed called the Public Financial Management Act on the 8th of August 2024. And that completely constrains the government to spend more than 13% of the forecasted GDP figure for that given year. So for this year, Sri Lanka can spend the forecasted GDP is 33 trillion rupees, and we are able to spend only 4.2 trillion rupees under that new act. And out of that, that's for recurring expenditure and also for capital expenditure. And the capital expenditure figure is 1.3 trillion. So for recurring expenditure, there's only about 2 point something they can spend. But what that act says is that even if you don't spend all the capital expenditure, you cannot use it for recurring expenditure. You cannot spend more than 4.2 trillion rupees, even if you collect more than that amount in your taxation and the policy process, right? So a lot of those things have been done. It really ties the hands of any administration. Whoever came would have been restricted by that. But I just feel that the current government, with this enormous mandate, should stand up to that act. They should try and say this was rushed through Parliament with really a government which was legal but not legitimate, right? And now this new government has an absolute mandate to make serious changes, right? And for that, you can't do business as usual. You need to actually say, we are going to take this on, and really be able to use the monetary and fiscal space to actually fulfill the development objectives and growth objectives, but which also protects the bottom 20-30% who are really suffering right now. You cannot do it within the current constraints because we have these IMF constraints they have put into us. If your hands are also tied with the rupee, what's the point in having a government, right? So you just need some scope to use the monetary policy and fiscal policies to improve the well-being of people and also the environment. You have to invest in these things.
Now you mentioned the act, which is constraining the government. Now, one of the things we at Newsfirst do, which irritates a lot of governments and politicians, is whenever a bill is placed on the website of the government printer, and that's the first place it becomes public, we go through every single such bill with a fine-tooth comb. And we are trilingual here. We have the 3 language desks. We look at in each language and we discuss. And we bring in experts and discuss further. And we flag the ones which just don't seem right. And there are many. Successive governments have done this. And we then debate it, discuss it, and then there is a general consensus. This is a bad bill. So, I could name a dozen such bills from last year alone. So, this government has the mandate, 159 seats in Parliament. It can simply look at what were those controversial bills, roll them back. If they are needed in another form, then reintroduce them in the proper form. But don't don't tinker with these bills, just roll them back. These bills were written with, I would say, a subversive purpose. We've seen this. We've seen the Online Safety Act, which came in. Things like that. They need to be simply rolled back. And this government has that power. It's not anything illegal, 159 seats in Parliament. So don't you feel that the present government is going a bit slow in rolling back these rather strange and odious laws?
Basically, there's 159 MPs, but they cannot do all the detailed work on the acts so you need your civil service to really give the support to fulfill the government's mandate. So generally what happens is the government is the one who puts the strategies and the policies and stuff. The civil service have to generally support them in that. They can't drive their own personal ideologies into the system.
Absolutely.
So I have a feeling that after decades and decades of certain types of civil service, they still are not, it doesn't seem that the government is getting the necessary technical support and stuff to do this work yet. And I think it's critical that they are given the support, because the government has a mandate and they require the full support of the civil service to do that work. The other act which really is harming currently the government, in my opinion, is the Central Bank Act. Independent Central Bank Act is quite good if you have a corrupt government, because they can just print money and do what they want. If you have a really progressive government who wants to really improve the well-being of the people and the country, you need the tool of the monetary policy tool in your hands. It cannot be outsourced to some unelected bureaucrats who are only looking at economic and price stability, but who do not really understand the needs for the funding for development needs, employment issues, right? So the Central Bank Act is really another one which is terrible for Sri Lanka. We have no control of the dollar, and if this government has no control of its rupee, you're really tied into a very difficult situation. So if you want a system change, some of these things are critical. The government, obviously you need to have the technical expertise. So the civil servants have to do their job. They have to really support the government. These are the priorities. If they say we want to improve the well-being of the poorest, we need these development projects, they have to come up with the solutions. It's not to say that it's keeping the status quo and talking about trickle-down economics and it will all happen the way it did before.
And of course, while we all are quite supportive of the central bank. I think I need to mention here that some of the worst scandals in our country's financial history did take place at the central bank, the bond scam, the Greek bonds and so on, which they may not have been engineered by central bank personnel. There were politicians at the helm, but certainly the professionals within the central bank should have been aware of what was happening, and they were really either silent or unable to prevent it. So the independence of a central bank or any organization, well, you're assuming that that independence will bring positive results.
But so even from a central bank point of view, there also needs to be sort of scrutiny of some of the decisions that have been taken. Exactly. And also the structure of that whole situation. I mean, I've heard that the IMF are sitting in the same building, same banks. They have access to the whole of the central bank employees. That's not a healthy situation for a country who wants to make changes, right? So I think if IMF need to be there, they shouldn't be that close to the central bank employees and officials, right? And there has to be some transparency. Are there scholarships given to the employees by these organizations? Are there grants being given, right? Are there because it could compromise decisions if people are influenced in that sort of way. So you really want a government to have control over the central bank, right? It has to be a democratically accountable institution. It can't be out there on its own. So even the way the central bank officials increase their salaries and have a different pension plan to the EPF and ETF type situation is not a healthy situation if you're looking at it from outside. So I think so there needs to be some reforms both in the Ministry of Finance and central bank, because these are key organizations for the government, and somehow the government needs to get a process going to make sure that they are directly supporting, giving the technical solutions, giving the innovative ideas to fulfill the mandate, because government 160 MPs cannot do that on their own. So you really need that support out there.
Absolutely. We need to take a short commercial break right now. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
For the first time in Sri Lanka, MIM, in collaboration with the University of Wolverhampton, offers 2 world-class master's degree programs: MA Film and Television Production, MSc Digital Marketing Management. Call now on 076 882 2707.
ඒගොල්ලන්ට මේ අපිට කියන්න බෑනේ මේ අනේ හාල් ටික හොයලා දෙන්න කියලා.
අහන ප්‍රශ්නේ තමයි උත්තර දෙන්න ඔබතුමාට අහපු ප්‍රශ්නෙට. ඌ බලාපොරොත්තු කන්දක් දීලානේ ඇවිල්ලා තියෙන්නේ.
සදාකාලිකව ඒගොල්ලන්ට කොරාය කිඹුල්ලු බල ඉන්න පුළුවන්.
ජනතාව බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන අත් වශයෙන්ම ශනික යම්කි සහනයක්.
දැනට තියෙන රජයයි ඒ තිබිච්ච රජයන අතර අහසට පොළොව වගේ වෙනසක් තියෙනවා.
මොකද අපි දැක්ක මීට පෙරත් ඔය ජවනිකාව අපි දැක්ක ඔය නාට්‍ය අපි දැක්කා. කලබල වෙන්න එපා රොෂාන්, අපි ඔයගේ ප්‍රශ්න කරන්න ආචාර්ය උපාධි සහතික නැතුණා කියලා කියන්න පුළුවන්ද?
අතේක පැහැදිලි කිරීමක් කරන්න වස්ස ඔබට තීරණය කරන්න පුළුවන්.
අපි හැමෝම එකතු වෙලා මේ රට හදමු.
දවස සතිය දිනවල සවස 6:30ට.
Welcome back to Face to Face. We are with Charith Gunawardena of the Institute of Political Economy, and we're talking about Sri Lanka's economic situation. Now, Charith, a few weeks ago, we had on this program Dr. Eric Toussaint, who is an expert on debt, and he made the clear point that Sri Lanka, we can still renegotiate the odious debt that we are struggling under, and considering that the government is so cash strapped, I mean, the government keeps saying that there's no money to do all the things that it wants to do for the people. But if we renegotiate successfully on this odious debt, the government would then have fewer repayments and we'd have more money. What are your thoughts on this?
So the IMF fourth review is happening in April, and there's another review in October. So there's a discussion about the next tranche of final tranche of payments and stuff going to happen. Now, if the government talks about renegotiation, you also have to understand the risks. So I certainly think it's essential the government does a debt audit, and that's something many countries, particularly people like Ecuador, did.
So debt audit means
is that you look at the accuracy of the records of the loans,
and
right?
where in the world the money actually went.
And not only that, but also the nature of the loan agreements, the debt management priorities, and also the impacts of exchange rate mechanisms, exchange rate changes on the economy and stuff. So there's a whole heap of work that needs to be done. And Sri Lanka hadn't done that. So we just didn't have a good view, and it's certainly not transparent. And without that debt audit, it's very difficult to start a renegotiation. So if there's scope to say that absolutely we're not going to walk away from the deal, that's as a nation we are going to fulfill our obligations, but it's a duty of a government to ensure that with a mandate to really understand what happened with these loans, and you need to have some clarity on that, because if some of those loans are odious, right, the country is having serious implications right now. So you need to really know what happens. But what the difficulty, like all these things are, is to understand the risks. So if you start that process, if I was in a government, I would not want to know what are the consequences, what could happen to exchange rate, inflation, if credit ratings change, right? Are there impacts on export issues, right? Not that there is a definite danger for that, but you need to just do the work. You need to understand that.
But then a debt audit is part of the duty of this government to figure out what went on in several regimes in the past. I mean, just as much as this government has promised anti-corruption and so many other things, a debt audit, I believe, is also in its mandate. It promised it to the people, to look into the circumstances of all this debt.
I'll be surprised if a government doesn't do a debt audit, because it's an essential part of that, and it's an important tool for a government to have, because even if the current negotiations go in a certain way, we have an unsustainable debt agreement between the multilaterals, bilaterals, and private bondholders. In 2028, we had to start servicing the debt. And the economy at the moment can't absorb even a slightest external shock. So there's a real danger. If anything happens, it could be Donald Trump, some policy, or it could be even a statement saying, don't travel to Sri Lanka, like we saw last September. There'll be huge implications to our economy.
Absolutely.
Already America is threatening tariffs of 10%. And 25%
it's happening already.
25% of our exports are to USA.
Exactly.
So what's the impact on?
Yes.
So there are risks like that. Now, if you do a debt audit, you arm yourself well. If you have to restructure again, I hope you don't have to, or you have to renegotiate again, you have a much better position of doing that than what we went up last time. We just went blindly, hand over the keys to Lazard and Clifford Chance to do that, and just followed whatever they said. Oh, it appears like that, right? And we haven't given a hard enough fight to protect the well-being of people. There was not enough social protection. There's not
quite frankly, Charith, I don't think there was sufficient transparency in the whole renegotiation process to to explain to the people what went on, because yes, there was a certain amount of transparency. Perhaps if you were an economist, you'd understand it. But for the people who really suffered when the bankruptcy happened, I don't think most people in Sri Lanka still have any understanding of what actually happened, how we came to be in such debt, and what the debt agreements which were signed last year actually entail, and where we are going. So, I mean, there needs to be a lot more transparency, and a debt audit is the basic step, in my mind.
I mean, that goes without saying. It is something that really has to be done, but that will take time. The Ecuador debt audit process took about 1 year. They set it up by having, I think, 4 departments in that part of the team: the finance, the central bank, the legal side, and the bribery commission, or whatever groups of people. They got some external experts, including Eric Toussaint and stuff, and there were other civil society people who were part of that panel. I think there were 12 people, and they had to do intense work for a year, but they had access to all the information from the government, so they were able to do that, right? And once you have the transparency, you do get into a strong position. So I think it'll be good if we follow that, at least use those as an example to start this process, because at the moment Sri Lanka is we are in a very risky position as far as the external debt is concerned. So you have to start the work right now, so that if you ever are in trouble, right, you're able to address that. But even the current deal, it's useful to know all the loans, right? And
absolutely,
and there has to be some responsibility these lenders take, particularly the private creditors. They earned huge amounts of profit, massive amounts of profit on those bonds, and they're still going after, and we haven't got an adequate haircut. So it's something that the country really needs to do, and there is a legitimate case. The government has a mandate from people to do certain things as far as the economy is concerned, and if this debt burden is an obstacle to that process, then they have the right to ask these questions. Now, it might be that those institutions who are just purely profit-making might take you to court and give you external other troubles, and that's something the government has to judge whether what are the risks. That's why I said earlier, you need to know, if you take this battle on, what are the worst case scenarios. So you can hope for the best, but you have to plan for the worst. So you really need to do some of that work. And I think today there isn't adequate clarity to really know where to go, the risky side. And I think the current, I think the central bank and the Ministry of Finance of stuff are not doing all the analysis to help the government to make those decisions.
Charith, it just seems so strange to me that 3 years after the bankruptcy, we still don't know what happened sufficiently. There's still this cloud of uncertainty over it. 3 years ago, we were, standing in queues. So fine, 3 years ago we didn't realize, we didn't understand. But now, after so much time, shouldn't we know what in the world went on?
That goes without saying. I think that's why I've said, certainly in 2 months after the government, it's impossible to get that view. But it seems as if they need to do that. Right? So I just hope that they will listen to the likes of Eric Toussaint, who has those experiences, right? Learn about it and initiate it, but do a really transparent audit. So there's no point going through a process just to say that you've done an audit, but if it's genuine need to find out, so you don't get into these situations in the future. And
the findings need to be made public so that we can all examine it. Now, let's look at the consequence of this. Now, we're paying so much. we're going to have to pay much more. And the government, which promised so much to the people, keeps saying that there's not enough money. And it is those in poverty who are suffering most. Nearly 7 million people, or almost 1/3 of all of Sri Lanka, were below the poverty line, the global standard for poverty. How are we going to, is there a sufficient amount of priority here? Is the government focusing on them to uplift them? And how do you uplift them? And I'm not talking about giving handouts. You can give a handout. Yes, the government, this government gave a wonderful handout to the children. I think 6,000 rupees a month for each child and so on. That's great, because you can't delay helping the children, right? Children need to learn, to grow, to eat, basically. But you need these families to come out of poverty. And to do that, is there enough of a focus on that?
So there are two aspects. So we have a dollar crisis and there's a rupee issue. There are two different issues. So you need to have a part of our economy to fulfill your debt obligations, external debt obligation. So that's where the exports or dollar earning businesses and services should be supporting that process. And one of the problems we have is that because we didn't get a sufficient haircut, still that debt burden is enormous. So 30% of government revenue from 2028 will have to be paid towards external debt servicing. 4.5% of GDP is what the IMF has said. Then on the other side, we have the rupee economy. Now, the way the IMF and stuff have put these benchmarks, even part of that macro-linked bonds agreement with the bondholders, they talk about the GDP is measured in dollars, but our economy is in rupees. So when there's exchange rate fluctuations, there's huge variations that are happening, right? So government has to look at its rupee economy. And the tools it has is basically the monetary policy and the fiscal policy to manage its revenue, right? So typically people say, oh, you have to only tax for revenue, but that's because in the neoliberal economic model, they don't want to talk about the central bank's role in using the power it has to do socially useful programs, right? So if the danger of central bank just pumping money out is the threat of inflation. But if you manage that also with taxation is removing inflationary excess currency in the economy out of circulation. So you have to balance monetary and fiscal policy. But typically, even in the West, they don't talk about the central bank's role, right? All they want to say is it's the rich who are subsidizing these lazy people who are not working, right? Without saying as a government, it's its duty to use the tools it has to improve the well-being of everyone. And I think, for example, if you take the jobs, right? People always measure jobs by is it paying back or not? And I think if you take an example of picking plastics up from a riverbed or the beaches, now is there a value to that, monetary value to that, right? But is it an important environmental thing a country has to do? Probably yes, because your biodiversity gets damaged, right? And there are many other things like that. So even things like care work, the people who are suffering a lot in the current country are the women who do a lot of the care work. Their services and their labor is not rewarded. There's a huge impact on their well-being in terms of monetary well-being, right? Now, should those people get paid for that services? It's not handouts. In advanced countries, they put the elderly into care homes and the state has to look after them, right? So here, families are looking after them, but the people who are looking after them are really struggling as well. So we have to look at this from a different point of view. Looking at it through the same lens is not going to give us new solutions. So even if you talk about economy and productivity, type of businesses you do, there are some good papers in Europe from there's an economist called Jason Hickel, and he talks about you need economic activity, but purposeful economic activity. So he says, what's the point of treating purposeful economic activity with activities like fast fashion, single-use plastics, big high-powered SUVs or private jets and yachts and stuff? That's economic activity, but those don't help society as a whole. And they're saying if you use the resources and the labor and the money used in those non-essential activity and you channel it back to essential economic work, then you might be able to address some of these issues which we are talking about. So if you take in Sri Lanka, there are about 1.6 million subsistence farmers, small 2 hectare and below farms. And those people are having a really hard time because businesses don't make products and solutions that make their lives easier or make that more efficient. So you see a lot of the farmers have huge amounts of food loss, post-harvest food losses, because they don't have the right drying systems or even the right storage systems. Now, as a nation, regardless of, you have to come up with some ideas. If you're going to help these small-scale farmers, one is that it's important food security. 80% of Sri Lanka's food is supplied by the smallholder farmers, right? So you really need to support them for multiple reasons. One is for improving their well-being. Other one is to also safeguard the food security. But also you want to, these are import substitutions. You can reduce your imports if you are able to produce a lot of this stuff yourself and not make it go to waste. Now, if you talk about solutions for these, I doubt whether private sector will do storage, secure storage bins for these small farmers because there's not enough money in that. But as a nation, do we need it? And I think we do.
Absolutely, yes.
So there was
that's the role of the state.
Yeah, no, I know in places like Guatemala, they had a lot of food losses in maize production. And they were losing post-harvest. A lot of the maize were eaten by beetles and bugs and stuff because their storage facilities were very poor. And what the government did, with also support from a overseas grant, they made these 1-ton storage units out of steel. They put the maize into that, and before they sealed it, so they were able to increase their the yields of their goods, and they reduced their food losses. Now, those type of solutions, so I know there are a lot of big discussions happening for big infrastructure projects like, I don't know, wind farms and stuff. But I think you also need to put some effort, solutions and products and services to improve the efficiencies and the well-being of the small holder farms, right? So I think that's where, when people say, oh, the state-owned enterprises are not really necessary and stuff, I'm pretty sure some of these big businesses won't give these solutions because there is not enough money to be made. But that's where, if you can get the right discipline and the right motivation and get the right structures in the state-owned enterprises, that's the type of thing they could be doing, or maybe be on a joint ventures with some local manufacturers. It could be regional ones. They could, but you have to really work on those. Now, I know there are some people who have done design work for using solar panels to dry grains and stuff. I drove to Mannar last week, and along the roads, all over the roads, you have people drying their paddy or peanuts and stuff on the main road. and you have to drive around those, right?
A common sight in Sri Lanka.
And you lose a lot of product,
Yes.
the amount of food losses, right? So there needs, and this is not just for Sri Lanka. Globally, there's about 30% of post-harvest food losses.
Absolutely.
So a country like Sri Lanka, we could take small steps to help that, and then it addresses some of the issues you mentioned. The people at the bottom 20%, because once they harvest this, there are 2 hectares of product. They might get 800 kilograms to a ton of material. They have to use some of that for their own consumption. Some they keep for seed, and the remaining ones they sell for income. So every bit you try to help them save, it's income for them. So there are a lot of things at the other end. People need to also try and innovate and think, and that's where some of these the state-owned enterprises or the government has to give the incentives and motivate people to do it locally as well. Because like you said, we don't have a lot of foreign currency to import stuff.
Absolutely.
Any simple solution, try and do it here.
Yes. Also, we are almost out of time, but I want to put this thought to you. There's this old saying, give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach him how to fish and he'll feed himself for life. Are we, in our poverty alleviation focus as a nation, are we too much into this handout business without actually looking at reskilling or upskilling those who are in poverty? And I'm talking about the simple things. Teach people how to drive a three-wheeler. No one teaches that. How to drive a heavy vehicle. Right now, it's all ad hoc. How to type, for goodness sake. How to operate on social media, because there are people who are making a lot of money on social media now, and these are all the types of things which can be taught quickly. It doesn't take years and years. So are we focusing enough on giving these people those skills? Because if you take whether it's garment factory workers or people in the plantations, they are doing the same thing that generations have done.
I think that's one thing I saw from one of the interviews with the Minister of Education. Is it Harini Amarasuriya? Is that
the Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister. They are trying to really put this education at the heart of this whole strategy, because if you currently you have a lot of scholarships from the rural areas to the top 20 schools, maybe in Colombo and other areas, right? And one of the things is they're talking about is, hey, you need to have that level of education in the rural areas,
yes.
Right? You don't want to have few elite schools and bring the best of the students there.
You bring the best here to Colombo, and then they finish school and then they leave the country. So
that thinking is happening. I think everyone, if you look at all the talk about the industrial strategies they are at least discussing, they are putting the skills and training as a fundamental part of the program, because without that, like you said, it's only basic sort of handouts which are going to work. But on that note, also there are some things like the elderly, disabled, and children have to be protected. So there's also some discussions I've seen about universal social services. If you have a scheme where you say any household which has kids, elderly, and disabled, because they are all registered, and you have a payment to them, you have a huge simplified way of giving these benefits. Otherwise, a lot of the people who require that are getting missed in their targeting systems.
The wrong people
are getting it, right? So there's a lot of new ideas that can be explored. And I think there are chances. The main thing is the focus also has to be on the bottom 20%, not just those abstract numbers like GDP and growth, which really doesn't ever trickle down to the people who need it.
Absolutely. Completely agree with you. And I'm afraid we are out of time. Charith Gunawardena from the Institute of Political Economy, it's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a good evening.